Hi, my name is Anil and you are watching Education Tatva. We are working on database series. Today we are going to talk about what are the database table, the most important one. So here is the example of employee table, and within employee we can talk about the columns. As you can see that there are different columns on this employee table: employee ID, first name, last name, email, and so on and so forth. So there are total 11 columns, which means 11 information can be stored in this table, segregated into different columns. Then what kind of data it can contain is determined by the type here, which is the data type. If it is number, it will just store the numeric value. If it is varchar, it can store number plus alphabets value. Whereas if it is date, it can store only the date information. Whereas some of the additional columns in this table properties, you can see the length. So length is overall the capacity of that column attribute. The number with 12 length will have maximum 22 length of capacity, and this is very important for designing the database table, that you should choose the data type length according to what you need. For example, if mobile number can be a just 10 digit number, and if you store anything, if you keep that length as 40, 50 or 100, so that will be a problem. You should avoid doing that, and you should use the length, because it is actually occupying the memory in your system. Then we have precision and scale, particularly used for number fields. So if we want to store any information in decimal, we can use the scale operator here, a scale value here. For example, if we need to store any value as 100.52, we can have precision as 3 and a scale as 2. So this can easily store your 3 into precision, whereas scale into 2. And then we have important columns as nullable. We definitely want to use some of the database constants, whereas this field is very informative and very useful. So for example, if we have nullable column as no, which means this column cannot have null value. Employee ID is the most important field in any employee table, or any primary key is important to that table. That is where nullable should be no for all such important columns. As you can see that for first name, this can be nullable, for the last name, it is nullable false. Similarly, this is applicable for all the columns. So while designing your database table, you should be very thoughtful about what should be the nullable value for that particular information. And you can also specify the comments, so that if you are not looking at the table, someone else is looking at the table, they should be able to get the meaning of each database columns by opening the definition of the database table. You can open this by simply typing describe command against this table, and we will show you how. The next important attribute we can talk about employees table as indexes. As we covered in the last session, if you have not seen, just click on the card above. You will be able to understand what are the indexes. Indexes are very important for you to manage your data. If this employee table could have millions of record, how to retrieve the record faster. So there are multiple indexes created on this particular table, like department, employee, and you need to be very careful while designing the indexes. So in case of primary key, if you are creating a primary key, what are the keys we will discuss in detail. But in general, as part of any table, if we decide this should be the primary key, we should use suffix as _pk. So by looking at this, we can see that this is the primary key index, which is created as part of a primary key constraint, whereas uk is for unique key, and then ix is your index. So if you look at this table, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 are the indexes which user or the database designer created and suffixes it with ix, whereas unique key and primary key becomes a index automatically, because they need to index the database table. On which column this index was built? This was built on department ID, email, employee ID, job ID, manager. And as you can see, this is a composite index, which means it is applied on two information, last name and first name, and in the given order. Which means if you are writing a query where you are using a where clause and says where last name equals to some value and first name equals to some value, so this index will execute. If you do the reverse, if you use the where clause as where first name equals to some value and last name equals to some value, this index will not execute. So you need to make sure how the index are created in the same manner you should use while writing the queries. Okay, so next we can talk about triggers. This is also important property of any database table. And triggers, so as we discussed in the last session, triggers are basically executed when any event on the table occurs. So as you can see that in employees, we have trigger on insert or update or delete, right? And this one is disabled. And this is the body part. What this trigger does, we will not go into the detail of it. We will create triggers and learn by that. Whereas you can see that there is another trigger which says update job history and it is enabled, and this is on update command. So anything which is updated on employee table, this trigger gets executed and it performs this operation. And as you can see, add job history is a procedure called from this PLSQL block which passes old employee ID, old hire dates, date, and some relevant information. So in general, these triggers are to maintain the logs of how the information is changed over the period of time. And this is very important. The last one on the tables is constraint. Constraints are very useful and very important because as a UI developer, if you are creating basic validation on your user interface, like date should not be in past date or date should not be in future date based on like how you are implementing it. Your employee name should not be blank. So that is a client level validation. But what if your user interface guy or UI designer team forget to implement such important checks? There is always a chance to keep these constraints at a database level. What kind of constraint you can apply? As you can see that employee email information, it is not null, which means you cannot save information in employee table until you have this condition met. So you cannot just pass any information with employee email as null. Similarly, your hire date, your job ID, and this one is important. You cannot input a employee information with salary as 0 or in negative. That's a check which is built. Now there are other checks which are created as part of what is the relationship between this table and other table. So as this table could be linked with other table as a master child relationship, so you can see that foreign key is also part of these tables. So which means employee table is the master table and some of the child tables like department, job, manager is actually linked with this foreign key information. And then we talked about this primary key and unique key. So it also creates as index, whereas this also creates as constraint. So primarily when you are applying these constraints, these indexes are auto built. So hopefully this was easy for you to understand. We talked about some of the database types. We talked about some of the important attributes and properties like triggers, indexes, and constraints on the table. Let's have a look and create a table ourselves, and we will definitely talk about the master child relationship and all those good details. Or if we want to do anything with database, for that reason we need to have a language which can speak and talk to database management system or database engine. So these are some of the important languages which database understands. What are these? Let's understand one by one. So the first one is data definition language. As its name suggests, data definition is whenever you want to create a schema, create a database, create a table, create a column, alter anything, which means you are defining the database structure, you will use database definition language, data definition language. It generally is create, alter. So create, alter, modify. These are the basic statements under data definition language. If you need to create a table, you need to modify the table. You need to create the schema, modify the schema. You need to create the structure, modify the structure. Whatever you say is part of data definition language. Once that definition is created, once the schema is set up, Next thing, you want to update some information in the database table, which means or database structure. What you can do is you can use database manipulation language, data manipulation language, which examples are like update, delete, right? After update, delete, and insert, these are some of the important actions that you can do, which means you can insert the data, you can update the data once it is inserted, and you can finally delete the data. We will see some real-time examples there. But what is data query language? We have created the table. Now we inserted some data using data manipulation language. We want to query the data. So anything which you want to retrieve out of the database table is part of the query language. And this is the most used language throughout the database. For any analytics operation, for any application where you need to do the reporting, you need to analyze the data. This is the must have requirement, and in most of the interviews this is the basic of all four language the database understand. Most of the questions are asked from database query language, DQL. Now the fourth one, which is more for the usage of database administrator. If you created a schema, if you created a database table, you want to give its access to someone else, and then you also want to control the access, like if it should have read only operation, it should have write, it should have execute. So there are different operations which you can alter through data control language, and in general for this kind of language you use the keyword as grant. So grant keyword is used for data control language. Let's create a very simple table. So I have logged into my live SQL Oracle session, and here this is the data definition language, which means create and then whatever you want to create. So you need to specify the object name. I want to create a table. What should be the name of that table? It should be test table. You can specify any table that you want to create. If that table already exists, you might see an error. You need to update that table, or you need to delete, or you may altogether use a new name. Then we have three columns in this table. Column 1 is number 5, which means it can consist of numeric value up to 5 length, and then it should be part of the primary key. So this table has one primary key. What are the keys? We'll discuss in the next session. Then column 2, varchar 2, which means it can have number and alphabets both, and it is not null as a nature. And the third one is date type. Let's execute this. If I run this table is created. Where I can see this table, I can go and see schema. Within a schema, it's my schema, and as you can see, this table is created just 6 seconds ago. This was the example of creating the table, which means running DQL command, and as you can see, you can have all the columns, indexes, triggers, constraints. As you can see, I have created a constraint for primary key, and then it also created one check that column 2 should not be, and that also reflects here as index. I have not created any index specifically. Now if we want to save some information on this database table, it's very quick. You can go to SQL worksheet, and then in here you can write insert statement, insert into test table, column 1, column 2, column 3, and you can store the values as first. I just want to specify the primary key, and then I can type in my name, and then we can talk about date. So we can mention 1st January, and you need to specify the date format here. It cannot take any value. What are the date formats? We can discuss that in detail. And this is very real-time example. As you can see, we specified the length of this column as 10, and since I am inserting 11 characters there, it will not take the value. Let's fix it. Now let's run this again. As you can see, this is inserted. So this was an example of data manipulation language. Let's select the data from this table. This is your example of data query language. I want to, and how to read this, I want to select what I want to select. I want to select all the columns in this given table, Otherwise, I could have specified column 1, comma column 2. So number of column that you want to select, you can put that as a comma separated value. Then from and on which table, this is the test table. I just removed the semicolon from this is statement, and I was able to run. So here is very quick example. What are the tables? We will learn more in the upcoming session. Okay, so with that, I was able to cover the table topic today, and hopefully you are able to run these yourself. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Thank you.